Hello, everybody, and welcome to the North Central College Department of Political Science COVID-19 seminar. My name is Bill Muck. I'm a professor of political science, and I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Suzanne Chod. Welcome, Suzanne.
Hi, everyone.
We are delighted to have you here. We are going to be talking about voting in the pandemic, fact and fiction of vote by mail. We're going to explore some of the claims and allegations made regarding voting by mail, what the research tells us. But before we get deep into that episode, or actually that issue, we thought it would be useful to start with some details on voting. Suzanne, you want to walk us through some of those elements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as Bill said, we want to talk about the fact versus fiction of vote by mail, especially with the pandemic. This is something we're probably going to see more of. But the most important thing is about voting. And so I want to take, since most of us are in Illinois or going to be voting in Illinois, want to give a little bit of information about how to register and vote in Illinois. So starting with the most important date, which is the general election, is November 3rd, 2020. That's on that Tuesday. And so how do you register in Illinois? Well, Illinois is one of 20 states where you can register online. So it's super convenient. So if you go online, and you can register up until 16 days before the election, which in this case is October 18th. It takes less than 30 seconds. Super, super easy. You can also register to vote by mail. It just has to be postmarked 28 days before, which is October 6th. You can also register in person, and that is up until October 7th, which is when the 27-day grace period in Illinois begins. You can still register to vote in person up after October 7th, but if you register to vote during that period, you have to also vote because early voting has begun. There are lots of options to register. So let's look a little bit, what do you need to register to vote in Illinois? So if you want to register, if you're not already, and everybody of course should, you need a driver's license, a state issued ID, a college ID. You can use the last 4 digits of your social security number, or a bank statement, a utility bill, something that has your home address and your name on it. It is very, very easy because there's so many different options of types of identification that you need to register. When it comes to voting, you do not need a form of identification. And if a poll worker asks you for one, then there are things that you can do on the spot there because you are not required to give a form of identification. The only way you would need a form of ID is if you're voting and registering during that 27-day grace period. But otherwise, if you are registered, you should not need a form of identification. So let's now talk a little bit about the details of voting. So in Illinois, we have no excuse absentee voting. So that means you don't need to explain why, but you can request from the state a paper ballot mailed to you that you fill out and mail back. Now, what we'll talk about today, and I'll get to later, is how is absentee and mail-in ballots different? And in the time of COVID, it's not actually that different, but we'll talk about that. So here are some details in Illinois. So right now, no excuse mail-in balloting. You can request it starting now. Actually, you could already have requested it starting last month, up until 5 days before the election. You can request one in person no later than the day before the election. It has to be postmarked by Election Day, and it has to be received by the election officials no later than 14 days after the election. There are some details there. If you want to vote early, we are a state that you can vote early, and that starts October 19th, which is 40 days before November 3rd. And as of right now, we do have day of in-person voting at your specific polling location. So I know that's a lot of information. As we get through, and when you'll see in the comment section, we'll have dropped some links in there to give you some more information so you can digest all of this. But here are sort of the nuts and bolts of how it's going to work in Illinois.
That was very good, Suzanne. I feel very informed right now.
Well, I appreciate that. That's what we go for every time, right? Is like now we know more than we didn't before.
That's right.
So there is a lot of talk, which is why we're having this webinar in the first place, about whether voting in the upcoming election is safe, and not just about physical safety, but also ballot safety. Can voters safely vote in person if COVID continues to surge? And if not, how can we ensure that there's access to voting, safe access to voting? Some states, like Illinois and others, have instituted expanded mail-in ballot initiatives, while others have already had them. But Bill, President Trump does not like mail-in voting. Tell us why.
So this is, just like everything else in our life, COVID flipped everything upside down. And if you're a state right now and the November elections are creeping up on you, you're thinking about how do we handle these elections in a safe way? And it's not easy to do. The last thing you want in a pandemic is a lot of people standing in long lines, crammed into small buildings. You don't want, people who are working in the polls, who oftentimes are elderly, to have all these. So there are all sorts of challenges. And what states started to do was thinking about, okay, mail-in voting or absentee ballot. This would be an alternative to the traditional way we vote. And we'll get into the distinction between absentee ballot and voting by mail in a little bit. But so this was one of the big ideas that came forward. Now, if you've turned on a television the last couple of months, or you've hopped on the Twitter, you have seen the President of the United States attack mail-in voting and really been critical of this. And what we're gonna do today is talk a little bit about the allegations that he's made, and then what does the evidence suggest. He's attacked vote by mail for two reasons. One, the idea that it's easy to cheat. And we'll address those issues and what the data suggests, but also that it benefits the Democrats. So that if we have additional mail-in voting, there's going to be cheating, and it's going to end up helping one party more so than the other. So let's sort of dive into the allegations that Trump has made. And they've been very theatrical and entertaining, but basically he's come out all over Twitter and said, you're going to see ballots that are stolen. People are going to go up to their mailbox and steal ballots. They're going to forge signatures on those ballots. Some people may be illegally printing ballots and submitting those, and then ballot harvesting. And we'll talk about ballot harvesting as well, which is the idea of picking up ballots and bringing them back, or maybe not bringing some ballots back. So this is a way of intervening in the vote. So you're seeing the one tweet up there where Trump says there is no way, zero, that mail-in ballots will be anything less than substantially fraudulent. They'll be robbed. Ballots will be forged. I mean, he really has been hitting on this over and over and over again. My favorite quote is the one at the bottom of the page there when he's talking about California. And he says, when the California governor sends out 28 million ballots in the mailboxes, and kids go and they raid the mailboxes and they hand them to people that are signing the ballots on the end of the street, which is happening. They grab the ballots. You don't think that happens? There's ballot harvesting, right? So he's all in on this critique and suggesting that this is a very, very dangerous thing to do.
I just have to say, what kids does he know that hangs out by mailboxes?
The
My
ballot
kids don't
stealers.
hang out by mailboxes.
That's right. So, I mean, it's sort of an entertainment value to it, but it's a really, really serious allegation. I think that's why we're going to grapple with it here today.
So let's talk a little bit more, Bill, if you could talk to us a little bit more about this. Could you tell us a little more about ballot harvesting? What is this? Why does Trump think it's such a problem? Do we have any evidence that large-scale mail-in voting, we would see fraudulent ballots, we would see counterfeit ballots? What do the data tell us about this?
Let's start with the data, and then we'll talk a little bit about the ballot harvesting or ballot collection. The loaded terms there. So the data is really, really fascinating, and there are a handful of states that are entirely mail-in voting. So you've got Utah, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Hawaii do mail-in balloting, and so there's a lot of data over a number of years. And what we see is that fraud is really, really rare, extraordinarily rare. They've done a number of studies, and we'll include some of those links in the comment section, where the incident of fraud is 0.004. Another one was 0.001. I mean, it happens, but it is extraordinarily rare. So that's kind of interesting to see that we're talking about so many ballots, and it really is very, very uncommon to find these. So that's, an important data point. Ballot harvesting or ballot collection, briefly on that, and we can talk more about the data. So there are states that allow you to do mail-in ballots or get your absentee ballot, and then allow somebody to pick that ballot up for you. And different states have different rules. Some states say it has to be a relative that can pick up your your ballot and bring it to a voting station. Others say it can be anyone, but you can only pick up so many ballots. California has a much more open system where you're allowed to pick up a number of ballots. It was quite contentious in one of the more recent California elections, where the Republicans accused the Democrats of ballot harvesting. But it's important to note that this is a legal practice. And the idea is that you want to increase the access people have to vote. And if we're talking about in a pandemic where it might be difficult for the elderly to get out and vote, this is one way to get around that. Again, different states have different rules, but for the most part, you've seen very, very little fraud dealing with any kind of mail-in voting. There was an incident in North Carolina with some ballot harvesting, but again, it's very rare. Suzanne, you love data. What's your sense of this?
So yes, I love me some data, and I will note that that the case, Bill, you're talking about was a congressional race, and it was actually campaign staffers for the Republican member that was running, where we found evidence of ballot harvesting. And so I think that that's an important sort of angle to bring in here. And I think the data point for me that is the most telling. So the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU, this is sort of the go-to place when you look at voter fraud, just more generally speaking. And so what they find is the number of cases related to absentee ballots. Okay, so, and then I'll talk about the difference, but let's just, generally say about absentee ballots, mail-in ballots, is even less. So it's been 204 cases in 20 years. And in that 20-year period, there have been 250 million votes cast. So that statistic is 1/6,000,000% of all of the votes.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that when someone engages in voter fraud that it isn't something that should be taken seriously, and every state has a different way they do this. Most of them, if not all of them, end up going to prosecutors, and they are prosecuted if it is found that it was done not by accident. Some of it really is done by accident. I forgot I registered here. My signature didn't match, whatever it is. 1/6,000,000th of 1% of all votes in the past 20 years. That is not that does not require the type of reaction that the president and other members of the Republican Party are giving, and then scaring people into thinking that vote by mail is not safe.
And one of the reasons I think there's been so few incidents of voter fraud is that the states that do this have really, really good systems for confronting that, right? And we'll get to that in just a second, but how they handle mail-in voting is really sophisticated, and that decreases the chance of anybody engaging in that conduct. Or if they do, it's much easier to detect that. Now, that does present a challenge if states want to do this and they haven't done it in the past, right? There should be an absolute realization that this is not an easy thing. That's not something you can do overnight. So if states are going to increase the number of absentee ballots that they're going to send out, or if they're going to try to transition to a mail-in vote system, it doesn't happen overnight. And you really have to be thinking about that ahead of time.
Yeah, that's a great point. That infrastructure is incredibly expensive. And the 5 states that have done it, they talk very openly about the time it took to sort of get it moving and kind of get it like a well-oiled machine. And we've seen in some of the primaries so far that it maybe didn't go as smoothly, but we have more time now leading up until the November elections for states to get this, get that infrastructure put in place. And there's a lot of things that have to happen because it is so safe to vote by mail. And so maybe, Bill, we can talk a little bit about what are some of those safeguards put in place, because there's a very long list of them.
Yes. So Suzanne, let's start with some basics there. How does mail-in voting work, and how is it different from voting by absentee? What are the safeguards against fraud within this type of voting?
Yes. So first, the point that you made is an excellent one. Let's distinguish between the two. So an absentee voting is when a registered voter requests a paper ballot come to them. Right? So it's for whatever reason, whether it's you're overseas, whether you're in the military, whether you don't, if you're a college student, for example, and you're living on campus, but you're registered in your home district or home state even, that you can vote by mail. You have to request the ballot. That is the major distinction between absentee voting and mail-in voting. Although, as I'll say in a second, they're kind of the same thing during a pandemic. Just to give an example, so 20 states and territories have excuse-only absentee voting. So you have to have a reason. So it's either for some of the ones I just mentioned, or you are a person with a disability or have a medical condition that keeps you from being able to physically go to the polls. 6 of those 20 states have now expanded to say that COVID is a reason you can request an absentee ballot. So 6 of those 20 have done that. But 35 states and territories have no excuse absentee balloting. So you can just request a paper ballot, and mail it back in, and you don't have to have a reason to do that otherwise. So vote by mail. Go ahead, Bill. Sorry.
Well, just, it's also an interesting data point. So we started talking about the president. President Trump is supportive of absentee ballots, or he's come out more lately and said that's okay.
Right.
It's just voting by mail that is concerning him. So that's why that distinction really is interesting. He's okay if you request the ballot. He's
Right.
not okay with the vote by mail system.
Where it automatically gets sent to you. So the 5 states you mentioned, every registered voter gets a paper ballot sent to them, and most voters vote that way. There are collection boxes across different states, or you can go hand it in, you can mail it in. And that is where he has the problem, is that ballots automatically get sent. So we use Michigan as an example. In May, the Secretary of State in Michigan sent applications for mail-in ballots to every registered voter in Michigan. And the president erroneously tweeted that Michigan was illegally sending mail-in ballots to all of their registered voters. And it's just not the same thing. And this is where conflating these concepts is really, really detrimental to when we look at the safety and legitimacy of our elections. And now that states have expanded, many states, so now we have the 5 states that do the vote by mail already. 5 additional states are automatically sending the applications for a ballot, which is like Michigan, I just mentioned. And then we've also seen since June, more states expand to allow for people to then request a mail-in ballot. So in this election, absentee voting and mail-in voting is almost exactly the same thing. So if President Trump says he's okay with absentee voting, he actually really is okay with mail-in voting, except in those 5 states.
Yeah. Let's jump to this next, because this is a perfect transition to will an increase in voting by mail benefit one party over the other? That's one thing you've seen the president hit on over and over and over again, that these mail-in systems will absolutely benefit the Democratic Party, and that if Republicans want to win an office, it's one of those things he said you can't have this. What does the data say?
The data say no, very conclusively. We've got a study out of some political scientists out of Stanford. We also see a study from a political scientist in Dartmouth that says there is an uptick in voting in those states, but not for one party over the other. There's just no evidence that one party benefits over the other. Bill, what did you see?
Yeah, exactly. And it's multiple studies, and it's really, really interesting, because I think the argument or the mentality the president has, that is, if you have people voting by mail, it will necessarily turn up turnout, and then that will benefit the Democrats, but not necessarily. It depends on how you look at this. There are some models that have suggested this actually would benefit Republicans, right? In a way where it means that the data, it's hard to tell that one party would necessarily benefit. And that's what you want, right? At the end of the day, you want a system that increases overall turnout, makes it easy for everybody to vote, and it doesn't benefit one party over the other. So yeah, my reading of the scholarship is it's pretty clear that this is not something that will benefit one party over the other, but it is likely to at least a little bit increase turnout.
Absolutely. And I think that's such an important thing to say, is that as you said it, so the data are not muddy, but it's because different groups would turn out more or less, and those groups are from both parties. So older voters are more likely to use mail-in ballots. Older voters tend to vote more Republican, depending on other intersections of identity, right? Younger voters and voters of color are less likely to vote generally, but I will add here, the data are very clear that those voters are also more likely to have their ballots rejected by state officials. So not only are they less likely to vote, but when they vote by mail, but when they do, their ballots are more likely to get rejected. So just those 2 data points may suggest that Republicans have an advantage. But overall, what the data tell us is that vote by mail initiatives really affect habitual voters. Those who already are in a pattern of voting are much more likely to vote when we see this expansion of mail-in voting. And again, as you said, that's what we want.
It's really interesting. I think I got ahead of myself a little bit. Could we go back and talk a little bit about some of the checks on those ballots? Like, because you were hinting at that, the signatures, the barcodes. Maybe tell people a little bit about how the mail-in voting system works, and so what are some of the safeguards against fraud?
Oh my gosh, how much time do we have? There are so many, right? That's exactly the point. And maybe we could both sort of talk a little bit about them. So it starts with verifying the voter's registration, and that the registration and the address, all that matches, and then a ballot, which is only a couple of companies actually print ballots. There's a certain weight of the paper. And in certain jurisdictions across the country, and there are tens of thousands of them, the ballots are actually unique. So we've got a particular weight of paper. We make sure that the addresses match up, right? And then a unique ballot with a unique barcode in a unique envelope is sent to every voter. And then they have to fill it out. they have to sign it, and then they have to put it in that unique envelope and seal it with that barcode and mail it in. And then once that happens, and once those ballots get to the election officials, then once they have to match up that the ballot matches the person. And if for some reason the signature doesn't quite match up, then they go and they check it, and then they cross-check it again. There are so many guards in place.
It's really rigorous. And one of the articles that I was looking at talked about that once you're exposed to that process and learn a little bit about everything that ballot goes through in terms of the barcode, the signature verification, a lot of those concerns go away. And it's really important to note that states that do this, you have, Democratic states that do mail-in voting, and you have Republican states that do this. And some of the biggest advocates have been Republicans to say that this system works really, really well. It's safe. And it's a wonderful way of getting people to vote. So I think that kind of addresses this idea that it will necessarily help Democrats. We don't know that, but it will help people vote.
It will. And what I think is, and I think you're going to talk about this in a little bit, is that it's really frustrating when the president comes out and now tries to delegitimize the sort of the general institution of voting in many ways, but now this sort of new way with mail-in voting. And because there's no clear advantage to which party, he may be dissuading voters from who would have gone out to vote for him, because there's a new study where the data suggests that when people are exposed to, especially Trump supporters are exposed to the information he's giving about maybe the illegitimacy of mail-in voting, even when they are confronted with that fact check, they're still more likely to believe that it's unsafe. And they may not vote for him. And that's actually bad for him.
Absolutely right. I mean, you don't want anybody not embracing the vote because they're afraid it's not going to be fair, right? And that's 100%. And you're right that the data suggests that this is having an impact on Republican voters who trust the system less, and that means they may be less likely to vote, and that's not good for anybody.
It's not. Now, Bill, what about the assertion that there's going to be foreign entities mass producing counterfeit ballots? What do we think about that?
Very difficult to do, right? When you think about all the checks that are in there, the specific types of ballots that are sent out, the voter rolls, right? I mean, that's the thing. So the states that do this are constantly checking the voter rolls to make sure that people are on there. They've got the right address. There's all sorts of verification points that make it really, really difficult to do that. And even if a foreign entity were to be mailing out lots of ballots, the minute they came back into the Secretary of State and were reviewed, would quickly be realized for what they are. I mean, the systems that we have are really, really efficient. It does mean that it's a challenge for states who are going to transition into that type of system. And as you noted earlier, makes an important case for starting early, but it would be really, really difficult for a foreign entity to intervene in the ballot. There's all other ways that they can intervene. We can
They've done it already.
Media. Yeah, but the ballot itself has a much higher bar.
And speaking of Barr, right, that Bill Barr is one of the people in the Trump administration that asserted without any evidence that we would see this sort of mass scale foreign interference with counterfeit balloting. And for all the reasons we just said, and I would say maybe more than anything, just the literal printing of the ballots because of the uniqueness of the weight of the paper and all of that, it is so highly unlikely that this would happen. And if I could add one more thing, which I think is an important part of it, is that yes, it's important to talk about voter fraud and whether we're likely to see it. And we've debunked these myths that we are not likely to see it in the way that the Trump administration is arguing. But then let's just say we had some counterfeit ballots, some fraudulent ballots that got through. What type of effect would those ballots actually have on the outcome of an election? So I did a little.
You got some data.
I got some data. I love me some data, and I'm using your home state as an example because who doesn't love Wisconsin? I suppose, right? Well, maybe Bears fans, but that's okay. So here's just to give some context. So Hillary Clinton lost Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin by about 70,000 votes in 2016. So a total of those three states, she lost a popular vote by about 70,000 votes. Had she won those states, she would have won the Electoral College. So to break this down, looking at Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton lost the popular vote in Wisconsin by 22,784 votes. So that says to me that for any kind of fraudulent or counterfeit ballots to have an impact on the Electoral College outcome of a state, in this case, there would need to be 22,784 of those ballots. I never say never, but the statistical likelihood of that happening, given the voter fraud stats we've seen, it's zero.
It would be incredibly difficult to do that, and would likely be detected. That's the reality. Yeah, even my home state of Wisconsin would be able to figure that out.
They did muck up the primary a bit. That was not a pun on your name, I realize, as
No,
I
no, no,
said it.
no. But I think
Yeah.
that's Wisconsin is a really important test case for, you know, their primary was not ideal, right? They didn't cancel the primary. You had people standing out in long lines. You closed polling centers. That's what we want to avoid come November. You want to have a lot of polling centers. You want to have a lot of voting by mail. You want to do whatever you can to make sure that the democracy expresses itself in a way that people believe the outcome, right? So I think that's why we should look to Wisconsin and some of the stumbles that they've had to say every state needs to be aware of these challenges and think seriously about how they can overcome them.
And I would say we look at states like Tennessee and Georgia, where we saw polling places closed around those states that disproportionately affected communities of color, where they were pounding on the door at the fairgrounds, for example, in Georgia, trying to get in. Or maybe that was in Tennessee. I'm sorry, but I think that was Tennessee, actually. That we're seeing disenfranchisement of voters of color even more if we don't expand these mail-in balloting initiatives because of the shrinking of polling places for in-person voting in November. So let's talk big picture.
Mhm.
There's no one better at closing the loop on big picture than Bill. So what are the consequences, would you say, of the President of the United States perpetuating false information about the security of our elections?
Well, I think for me, the big picture is the trust in our institutions. And what we've seen over time, whether it's the United States or looking at other countries around the world, it's much easier to destroy trust than it is to build it up, right? So faith in our institutions, it takes a long time and years of success for us to believe that these institutions are legitimate. It's very easy to erode that. And the president is in a unique position to offer strength in those institutions or to erode them. And when he makes these kind of allegations that there's going to be widespread fraud, that the election would be rigged, it hurts everybody, right? Because we all play the game, we all show up to vote believing that the system is fair. And I think the data and the research suggests that for the most part, it really, really is. We have a really robust system. And there are ways where the democracy can be pushed, and, you know, social media and all of those things are real concerns. But when it comes to the actual vote, we do a really, really good job of that. And so when he makes these allegations, it hurts the system, it undermines the democratic norms. And if people don't believe the system is fair, they're not going to want to play by the rules, right? If everybody believes the game is fair, they say, hey, if I lose this time, I'm going to fight like hell and try to win next time. But if you think the game is rigged, and if you think the system is rigged, you would do everything you can to win. And that's my fear here, is that by undermining these institutions, it's going to encourage people to believe that the system isn't fair. And then whatever the results are, to question those. Think back to the 2000 election with George W. Bush. Very, very contentious. We're counting ballots, hanging chads, all of that sort of stuff. And at the end of the day, the Supreme Court came in and said, boom, here's our decision. And everybody accepted, and we moved forward. Now, some people certainly were not happy with that, but they accept the legitimacy of the election. And I think it's really important that all candidates do that. And I think the president be aware of the importance of his voice. And that, you know, nobody in the history of the United States has argued that an election was rigged at the presidential level. And I really hope that continues to be the case. So I think that's why this is so important, that we understand the way in which, you know, the system is a really, really good system, and states, if they do it right, can expand the vote, especially in these unprecedented times.
Right. We should want more voting, not less.
Absolutely. Well, maybe on that note, let's remind the people, Suzanne, about how to vote, and then we'll get out of here.
Remind the people what they want, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that Bill and I talked about when we decided we wanted to do this was not only to debunk the myths about it, but to do that in order to encourage people to vote, right? We always want to encourage people to vote. So what I want to remind everybody is November 3rd is election day. You can already, in the state of Illinois, if you are a registered voter, or if you're not registered yet, you can register and then request a mail-in ballot if that is the way you feel the most safe voting, because you don't want to vote in person. Hopefully we've persuaded you that your ballot would be safe and that it would be checked and rechecked and checked again and not harvested in any kind of way. We are going to drop a bunch of links in the comment section about where you can go for information about ballot access, also about information about like what's on your ballot, your address specific ballot, and how do you get information about the people and the issues that are on that ballot, and then always reaching out to us for questions that you have.
Thank you so much. We will be having a Q&A session on July 23rd at noon. So if you want to ask us more questions, get more into the details, we gave you a little bit of the details, but we're absolutely happy to go into the weeds for the Q&A session. So thank you so much for joining. Thank you, Suzanne. This was really helpful, and we look forward to hearing from you either at the Q&A session, or feel free to find us on social media or shoot us an email.
That's right. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone. Take
All right.
care.